Falcoholics. What is up? Welcome to the first non-live edition of the Falcoholic Live of the 2022 offseason. I've been promising it for some time. It's finally here. We're going to break down the biggest, perhaps, question of the offseason for many. At least the question I get asked about the most, which is how much cap space can the Falcons actually create in 2022? It's a difficult question to answer because there are a number of ways they could go about doing this. We're going to get into the most likely ways, the easiest ways, the ways that I sort of expect that they will. This is not an all-encompassing list, but I think this is probably the closest guess we can get. So we'll be looking at things like veteran cuts, potential trades, and of course restructures and extensions that make sense for the Falcons to sort of come up with a picture of exactly how much money they can save, and then of course taking that in conjunction with their current cap situation, which we will talk about in just a second. We'll find out sort of how much money they realistically have to play around with. And before we sort of get started, I will sort of touch on that, which is the Falcons are actually negative to start off the year. You've probably seen this if you looked at sites like overthecap.com or Spotrac, which are the sites that I use mostly for my cap stuff. So currently the Falcons right now are sitting at minus 5.9 million, just so you know. And that's with 52 players on the roster. So they do actually have enough players on the roster to qualify for the top 51 rule. If you don't know what that is, you can check out one of my videos from last year where I go over sort of all of these rules and things like that. Basically, only the top 51 most expensive contracts count against the salary cap for most of the offseason. So they already qualify for that, which is good, but they are minus 5.9 million overall because of dead cap and the amount of contracts that they have and that cost. The other thing we have to keep in mind is the cost of the draft class, which right now is projected to be 5.9 million as well. Sort of an interesting coincidence there. That includes the top 51 rule because some of those draft contracts will actually be cheaper and won't cost anything, which is why it's so low. However, that number doesn't include any additional picks that the Falcons might get, like picks from these trades we're going to talk about. So keep that in mind. This is just an example, but when I talk about, effective cap space and sort of how the Falcons have to maneuver around their existing obligations, that's the numbers that I'm talking about. So without further ado, guys, let's jump right in to how the Falcons can clear some cap space and how much we could be looking at in total. All right, guys, so let's get into some of the avenues for the Falcons to create cap space in 2022. The first one, the easiest one, kind of the saddest one, would be veteran cuts. Obviously, one of the saddest parts of the NFL business is saying goodbye to those veteran players, especially for salary cap reasons. But the Falcons, once again, are finding themselves looking at another round of tough decisions this year. There are 3 contracts in particular that sort of stand out as kind of no-brainer moves in terms of cap space save versus dead money. First one, you've heard me talk about before, Tyler Davison, the defensive tackle. The Falcons saved $3.7 million from his cut and have just $1.2 million in dead cap. So, Davison's always been sort of a solid run stuffer, had some pretty good years under Quinn and Morris, but didn't really have a great year in DMP's defense. Not really a traditional 3-4 nose tackle. He's more of a 4-3 shade nose. His play sort of fell off, as did his snap count. As the season wore on, he started losing snaps to guys like Anthony Rush and Taquan Graham. It's really hard to pass up on that savings, so I don't expect Davison to return. I expect the team to go after that savings. The next one is maybe a little bit more controversial. That one's Mike Davis, the running back. They would save $2.5 million from his cut with just $750,000 in dead cap. Davis really didn't have as bad a year, I think, as some are putting out there. However, he's a running back making over $3 million on a roster that just can't afford it. So it's possible he sticks around, right? If the Falcons do decide not to try to re-sign Patterson, they do want some sort of veteran presence, and they think Mike Davis is their best option there. It's possible that he does return. I just think it's doubtful. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil that in as one of the cuts they'll make as well. Also, we have Kendall Sheffield, which this one is probably the biggest no-brainer of all. Sheffield saves $2.5 million. It's the final year of his rookie contract. Just $189,000 in dead cap. He barely saw the field in 2021. He was hurt, of course, but he just wasn't able to get on the field over the younger rookies, those sorts of players. He's making way too much money for a backup and special teams guy. I think that this one's sort of a foregone conclusion. Really easy way to save some desperately needed money there. And that brings us to the total. So if they make these three moves, they move on from Tyler Davison, Mike Davis, and Kendall Sheffield. That right there would be $8.7 million in savings. That's a decent chunk of change that already gets them positive in terms of getting under the cap for the start of the league year in March, which is required, ladies and gentlemen. They have to be under by the time free agency starts, or the NFL start voiding contracts and things like that. Rarely do we ever see that happen, because teams know they have to be under. So these are the three moves I think you'll see them make before the season starts, to just sort of get under. Those are the easy ones. The next two that we're going to talk about are trades. And of course, these ones seem sort of likely to me, but trades are notoriously hard to predict in the NFL. So we don't know exactly how they're going to go down, when they're going to go down, that sort of thing. But I do think they will go down at one point or another. And there seem to be two pretty clear candidates for trades. The first one we've talked about to death all offseason. Wide receiver Calvin Ridley. We're not really going to touch on any of that, just to say that the writing seems to be on the wall. Starting to feel to me like a trade is kind of inevitable for Ridley. I hope he and the team find a mutually beneficial arrangement. I hope the Falcons are able to get a first rounder back, and Ridley's able to go to a team that he wants to go to succeed elsewhere. No hard feelings. The other flip side of this is it provides a lot of cap relief for Atlanta. So if Atlanta comes away with the first round pick and this $11.1 million in savings without any dead cap attached, it's not the worst thing in the world for Atlanta. Obviously, you'd rather have Ridley in tow to have that established presence in the receiving core, but it could be worse. So as long as the trade is good and you get that cap savings, it's not that bad. That's a decent chunk of change there. The other one is linebacker Deion Jones. I feel like this one's almost as inevitable. Jones did not have a good year in DNP's defense. It seemed like the effort was lacking at times, and I think that's sort of a big red flag for this coaching staff. I think they will try hard to move him. His cap hit this year is just absolutely massive. The reason for that is all the restructures they've done to him. They actually restructured his contract twice last year. So the good news for the Falcons is they can save $9.3 million by trading Deion Jones, and because most of his cap hit is this prorated bonus, the team trading for Jones is only going to have to pay him about $9.6 million in base salary. Falcons do have to eat that $10.7 million in dead cap, but that's just sort of a salary dump at this point. It's kind of inevitable. I think it's probably better for everyone, including the cap and the team, that Jones goes to a defense more suited to his skill set. The Falcons hopefully get some kind of pick for him. I'm hoping for like a 5th rounder, maybe a 4th rounder, but it could be less than that. It's mostly a salary cap move for Atlanta. It's technically possible they could save more. I haven't really been able to find the info I've been looking for on this, but part of Deion Jones' dead cap is a $4.5 million roster bonus. That typically those roster bonuses guarantee on like the 3rd or the 5th day of the league year, so it's possible if the Falcons trade him very quickly, the new team would take on that bonus. Falcons could save another $4.5 million, but I don't know exactly how that works with this contract. It may or may not be an option, and also it might be hard to find a trade partner that quickly. It might be easier to move him if the trading team didn't have to pay that bonus. So we'll just go with the standard numbers in terms of our calculations, but that's an option. So from those two moves, the Falcons save a whopping $20.4 million in total. Obviously, that's big. That's a lot of money. That's going to be key. That's going to be a big part of their spending money / ability to sign their draft class and that sort of thing. There are 2 other players that we'll just briefly touch on, just because technically it's possible they could be traded. I don't think it's likely, but I know people will ask, so I'll put this in here real quick. Matt Ryan, if they were to trade him pre-June 1st, which is a standard trade, they would still save $8.1 million, but they'd have to eat $40.5 million in dead cap. If they traded him after June 1st, the savings are a lot better. I think it's like over 20. But it would be harder to work that out. So, not really going to touch on that at this point. If the Falcons end up taking a quarterback like really early in the 1st round or something, the chances of that happening might go up. But don't think it's particularly likely at this point. The other one would be Grady Jarrett, who there's been some buzz about with a trade. I don't think it's going to happen, but if they did trade Jarrett, $16.5 million in savings, $7.3 million in dead cap, and you're probably getting a first-round pick in return. So that's the numbers for that. Again, don't think that's likely. Not going to use those as a part of our calculations. You'll see why here in just a second, but $20.4 million is the takeaway from the trades for Calvin Ridley and for Deion Jones. And then the final group that we're going to talk about, restructures and or extensions. And this is why I didn't want to do the trades for Ryan and Jarrett, because I think it's more likely that we're going to see these two guys extended and or restructured. Obviously with Ryan you can do either, but Grady Jarrett you can only extend him because this is the final year of his deal, so you can't restructure a deal to spread money into future years if there's no more future years. So right now I'm sort of leaning towards the Falcons probably doing what's being called a void year restructure these days. So they basically add dummy years onto the contract. With Ryan I would think they'd probably do 2 void years. And basically when you restructure it, then it spreads the bonus money out over those fake years. So the savings is a lot higher. It also doesn't raise the cap hit nearly as much for next year. So it preserves their flexibility with Ryan a little bit more next year. And the Falcons could save, I believe, up to $11.3 million with that sort of restructure if they maxed it out. I don't know that they would necessarily want to max it out. They might want to, the less you do, the more flexible you are in future years. The more you do, the more money you have right now. But you offload more dead cap later. So it's sort of a balancing act depending on the free agents they want to pursue or how much they need. That'll determine how much they try to go after with Ryan. If they did extend him, that would be the way to clear a lot more money. They could clear up to $18.1 million this year with that extension. But you're committing to Ryan long term. You're probably adding a lot more guaranteed money to the contract overall than you would be with the restructure. So this would be a move if the Falcons want to keep Ryan past 2023. They probably do like a 2-year extension through 2025. And this would be financially, it would help them financially, more this year. But it would keep them tied to Ryan for longer, which maybe isn't a bad thing. It's just I don't know if that's the plan they want to go. If they do the restructure, they're not tied to Ryan past 2023. They could be totally out of that deal in 2023, except for the void years, which hopefully wouldn't be too extreme unless they try to restructure again next year. But they would have more flexibility if they do the restructure versus the extension. But we'll see what they decide to do there. With Grady Jarrett, obviously extension is the only option because it's the final year of the deal. I wouldn't do the trade. I would not trade Jarrett. I think you need to start somewhere. You have to build around something. If you get rid of Jarrett, you have nothing. So I'm just a big fan of keeping Grady Jarrett, not just because I own the jersey, okay? Because I think he's a great player. If you don't have Jarrett, it's just like hopes and dreams out there, and I don't like that. So, if it was me, I'd give Jarrett a big 4-year extension, lock him up through his early 30s, and you spread that cap hit out mostly in the middle years of that contract. You probably want to leave the final year basically unguaranteed and without a lot of bonuses so that you have more flexibility if he does happen to fall off late. But they could save up to $12.3 million with an extension of Grady Jarrett this year. Again, who knows if they'll max that out or not. They may try not to, depending on how much money they need. But if they were to do the maximum restructure on Ryan and that maximum extension on Grady Jarrett in terms of how much they free up in space, they would save $23.6 million from those two moves. So that's another big chunk of change to play around with. Another potential restructure option that I'll just touch on quickly is Jake Matthews. That's another one. I don't think they'll touch his contract again. They've done it a lot. But they, potentially could save up to $5.7 million or so by restructuring Matthews as well. I sort of don't think they'll go that route, but it's possible if they really want to maximize their cap space this year. So that's just something to keep in mind. So with all the moves that we talked about right there, I know it's a lot. We're looking at $52.7 million in total cap space that they saved from those array of moves. So that's a lot of money. That is a good chunk of change. It's much better than they could have done last year. It does give them some flexibility in free agency to re-sign their own guys, to get their own players back, to go after perhaps a big name free agent, more likely a series of mid-tier guys, but we'll see what they want to do. It's important to note also that there is the $52.7 million that they cleared, but they do have to pay off their existing debts, right? So effectively, their cap space could be as high as $40.9 million after they have to pay off their existing $5.9 million deficit, and then calculating that they need to keep at least $5.9 million for the draft class too. So instead of 52.7, don't circle that number. Circle in your head this 40.9 million number, because that's their effective cap space they can play around with. And again, still a good number, still a good amount of money. If they do go after some re-signings, that'll be the topic of the show next time. Signing someone like Oluokun or Patterson, those guys are going to cost a lot. Russell Gage. So if you go re-sign all those guys, then you're probably not looking at more than like 20 million left for other free agent signings, at most. So depending on what they do, could be a lot of differences there. But guys, really appreciate everyone for tuning in and watching today's show. I hope it was illuminating for you. I hope it gave you some good intel about the cap situation. Obviously, we've got a lot of offseason left, a long way to go, but this hopefully should give you a primer about approximately what the Falcons will be working with as the offseason unfolds and we go into March here. So keep an eye out for these moves. Keep an eye out for what exactly they do with guys in terms of restructures and extensions, and see how close my prediction is to coming to fruition. But in the end, I wouldn't expect it to be drastically more than this amount. It could be less if they don't do as many moves, if they're not able to make these trades happen. But that's sort of my prediction and my guess, and that's sort of the upper end probably of what they could save. So we'll see what they decide to do. But that's a good start, basically, on what my thoughts are on how they could potentially clear space. Again, guys, thanks again for tuning in. If you've not tuned into the channel before, we have a live show, live streamed on Wednesdays at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. That's a lot of fun. We do cover a lot of Falcons topics, have a lot of great guests on, players, hopefully some coaches this offseason as well. Former players, great Falcons media guests. So keep an eye out for that and enjoy tuning into those shows as well. Also, please do check out the Patreon page if you're interested in supporting us here. It's patreon.com/Falcoholic Live. If you're interested in helping pitching in on a monthly basis, as well as getting access to some exclusive content and the like. Again, guys, I'm Kevin Knight at Falcoholic Kevin. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Falcoholic Live.